introduction. Okay, so this afternoon I'm going to talk to you about mad studies and the maddening of social work. Now, I've pitched this talk sort of at the introductory level, and I've done that because I want to try to speak to everybody in the room. But I also appreciate that there's a number of folks here who are coming here with a more sophisticated understanding of mad studies. And so what I'd like to do is just to encourage you during the question time to maybe think about commenting and contributing as much as you're asking questions at the level that you're at of understanding of mad studies. For those of us who are crazy or lunatics or a bit mental or however else they decide to deem us as mad, I want to encourage you to think about commenting more than questioning when it comes to the questioning period, the period when we ask questions. And I'm asking you this because I don't see myself as an expert in mad studies, but it's a field that is evolving out of collaborative conversations, usually within mad communities. And so I want you to think about what contributions you might want to make at the end of this talk. I also want to ask you to think about what it might mean to have discussions with other people in the room over the next couple of days if you feel that this is a space and a time where it's appropriate to have those kinds of conversations. Okay, so that being said, I have 4 slides, as I promised last night at dinner. But don't be fooled by that, because I could probably talk for 2 hours. So I'm going to ask Ariel that if I seem to be going on for more than 10 minutes a slide, you might want to gently nudge me on. Okay. So 4 slides starting now. Okay, so let's start off with just a note on terminology. So I'm talking about, I'm using the word mad, I'm talking about madness. This is terminology that a lot of people might find offensive, might invoke anger, might invoke distress. And why do we use it? Why do we use it in mad studies? We do because these are terms that have been reclaimed. Okay, so I won't say completely like, but similar to the ways in which the term queer has been reclaimed within the queer community. The term mad has been reclaimed as well. But I also want to make it really clear to folks that when people take on the terminology and claim mad identity, that we're not talking about an essentialized identity that means one thing. It's a heterogeneous term. People use it to mean different things. I'll give you a couple of examples. Some people write the term mad with a capital M, some write it with a small m, and those denote differences in terms of how they're understanding the term, with the capitalized term usually being a more politicized notion of the ways in which mad subjects have been oppressed historically into the current time. Okay? Some people use the term mad to talk about particular alternative experiences of reality or distress or euphoria or other experiences that has traditionally been pathologized. They use the term mad to refer to those actual experiences. Some people use the term mad instead to suggest, well, I don't actually think that there's something about my thoughts, my behavior, my feelings that actually can be deemed mad, because my thoughts, my feelings, my experiences are part of a range of human experiences that we should just understand as human experiences, rather than categorizing some folks as crazy and some folks as normal. Okay? So there's different ways in which people are using this terminology, which might not be wholly helpful to you if you're just entering the field and trying to make sense of it, but something to keep in mind is just the heterogeneous nature, and that when we talk about mad identity, it is not something that you can essentialize into one thing, which tends to be sort of the approach that people take when they're trying to make meaning and make sense of new ways of forming experiences. Okay, so Mad studies itself is something that has emerged from primarily within mad communities. Okay, so I can talk about the mad community, but really we're talking about mad communities, and we're talking about social movements that, and usually characterized by activism, but also characterized by research and alternative practices. We're talking about communities of people who've been deemed mad, who are suggesting there's something really wrong with the ways in which psychiatrization takes place in our society. Okay. So it, like a collaborative effort within the MAD community, in addition to quite a strong influence from critical disability studies. So a number of MAD scholars who were actually studying within critical disability studies in conjunction with the MAD community came up with this notion of what MAD studies might look like. And the term itself was coined by Richard Ingram, Dr. Richard Ingram, in 2008. And again, the idea behind the coining of this term is that as MAD community members, we require a field, a discipline in and of ourselves that is separate from critical disability studies, but that also is connected to community and is not just something that exists within the academy. So what does it look like? Well, there's a whole history dating back in Canada to 1970, 1971 of the existence of psychiatric survivor community, for example, where people were engaging in alternative practices, people were researching what was happening to each other, and people were theorizing their experiences. So I want to make really clear here, we are not talking about this consumerist notion of service users having a voice. We're talking instead about people who have been deemed mad, theorizing, not just narrating their experiences, but theorizing their experiences as well. Okay, so that's a crucial point, and it's one that actually connects to this notion that typically within psychiatry, there's a form of epistemic injustice that takes place where people who've been deemed mad are not allowed to be knowledge holders. And so what we're saying within MAD studies is we're centering the knowledge that's emanating from MAD community and people who have been deemed mad. Okay, so Richard Ingram has also characterized MAD studies as what he calls an indiscipline. Now, myself and Jijin Veronka and also in another article with China Mills, we've been deconstructing what that might mean for MAD studies to be an indiscipline. So I want to play with this a little bit to show you the complicated ways in which we might understand this. So when we suggest that the Academy needs MAD studies, what we're suggesting is that we need a discipline of our own, right? An academic discipline. But what we're also suggesting is that MAD studies is not something that just happens in the academy, it's something that happens in MAD communities as well. And so we bring in this notion that it's not quite a discipline, maybe it's an indiscipline. And maybe we're going to actually start to break down and deconstruct within the academy what is considered a discipline and what is allowable knowledge within the academy. Okay. It also toys with this notion of the ways in which certain bodies and certain minds are forcibly disciplined through treatment. And that perhaps we might want to think about what it might mean to allow for indisciplinarity in our behaviors and in our thoughts. So here what we start to do is we start to break down this notion of rationality and reason that supposedly underpins all knowledge within the academy. And so we're playing and we're toying with these issues. That's the exciting part, it's not supposed to choke me up. Okay, so why math studies? Why do we need this? Why do we need this discipline? What is the problem? Well, the problem is that the vast majority of service users within psychiatric services experience it as oppressive and violent. Okay? Now, there are some people who feel that the drugs help them. There are some people who feel that electroshock has actually improved their mood despite any permanent memory loss that might be associated. There are positive experiences, but those positive experiences are the minority. Okay, and so what we're suggesting is that in actual fact, we need to start deconstructing this violence and finding ways to create alternatives that are not violent and that are not oppressive. Ways of accepting people's differences that does not pathologize and that doesn't individualize experiences. What do I mean by mental health services individualizing experiences? This is this whole idea that it's all in our brains, right? So there's a chemical imbalance. Something genetically wrong with you. It's inside your body, right? It's not anything about what's going on in the outside world and the violences and the trauma we experience on a daily basis. It's not about that. It's not about colonization. It's not about racism. It's not about sexism. It's not about any of this. It's about our brains, right? So this is the broken brain, the pathologizing model that is used within psychiatry. Well, despite the fact that the medical research community decided long ago that the chemical imbalance theory actually doesn't hold muster. It's just not correct. They've done decades and decades of research, spending tons of funding on researching this chemical imbalance, these chemical imbalances for different disorders, and haven't found one. And I think it's probably close to 15 years ago that we see within the bigger medical journals editorials stating quite clearly, okay, we need to abandon this notion of the chemical imbalance in the brain theory because it's not fruitful. We're not seeing this in our research. Still today, however, we find psychiatrists telling their patients, you have a chemical imbalance in your brain and you need these medications, and that's going to make you better. So what we do know anecdotally is that there are a lot of psychiatrists who, A, haven't read the literature and don't realize that the medical community is no longer accepting this notion of the chemical imbalance theory. And we have other psychiatrists who are well aware of the fact that it's been discounted, but they still say it to their patients anyway because they feel that if they tell them they have a chemical imbalance, they're going to comply with their treatment of taking drugs because the two match, right? So if you have a chemical imbalance and you take this pill, it's going to balance it all out. If you don't have a chemical imbalance, what would motivate you to take the pills that the doctors are giving you? Right? Okay. This is violence. This is lying. This is not being honest to people or not keeping up with your practice. We also hear that it's genetic. But of course, despite decades and even more money that has been put into genetic research in mental health, they have yet to find a gene or even a cluster of genes that links to any of the mental illnesses in the DSM. Everybody here know what the DSM is? So, what we have is a system that is completely locked into a biomedical explanation of people's experiences and biomedical forms of treatment. And this is experienced as oppressive by some people. The oppression, however, is not just about the treatment in terms of drugs and electroshock, which are the common forms of treatment, the first line of treatment that's provided to people. It's also just about people's experiences on the psychiatric ward. So you might decide to become a voluntary patient on the psych ward, you're not doing well, you don't know what's going on, you're frightened, this is not okay, you go to the hospital, you think someone's going to help me there. And then you sit on a ward, and no one talks to you for 24 hours. You don't know where you're supposed to go. You're crying. People are looking at you like, what's your problem? There's this sense of hostility. There's this sense of professional distance. There's a lack of what people find supported, just on an interpersonal level within many of these psych wards. So we're talking about all sorts of forms of oppression. We also know that patients get raped at a very high rate within psychiatric wards. And one of the things that has made this possible is that if you're deemed mad, the police are not likely to think that it's true when you go and say you've been raped by either another patient or a nurse or a psychiatrist or an orderly. You're not likely to be believed. So this is fairly rampant, this form of violence on psych wards, and we have research that backs this up fairly. I mean, I've looked at the research within English-speaking Western countries. So we have this professional distance, we have this paternalism, we have this notion that we know best, and what's best is probably not what you're going to feel is comfortable or helpful. We also have the targeting of racialized and indigenous people within forced psychiatric treatment. So much like the justice system, we have the overrepresentation of racialized and indigenous people as involuntary patients of psych wards. We know this from the statistics that have been taken. The more we criticize the psychiatric system as being racist, the less they actually show us what their statistics are in terms of their numbers of who's being targeted and who's coming into the wards. But what we know from what we have been able to see is that not necessarily voluntary treatment, but in relation to involuntary treatment, we see this overrepresentation and this targeting. So what does this mean for social work? Well, as social workers working on multidisciplinary teams, for the most part, I think social workers play the role of what I've called here subordinate attendants to psychiatric expertise. Okay. Now, Adam has referred to this in relation to nurses as playing a handmaiden role to psychiatry. I'm not going to use that terminology because I think it's a little bit unfortunate, but I'm trying to find some way of pointing to the fact that what social workers do when we end up working in the mental health system is we turn away from the social in social work, we turn away from our social expertise, and we then become the attendants to psychiatric expertise. And what do social workers do, usually? Usually they're the persons who are coercing patients into signing in as voluntary patients, right? They're being used to do the dirty work. They're being used to do a lot of the work that's experienced ultimately as oppressive by many people in the system. What I also wanted to say is that, you know, what biomedicalism does, and I think that biomedicalism is intimately tied with neoliberalism. And I could spend a whole other hour talking about that connection, but maybe we can think about some of the other presentations and connect those dots ourselves. But, you know, the focus is on how can we cure, how can we contain, how can we profit from mad subjects. And this is problematic, right? Where is the empathizing? Where is the allowing for difference? Now, there are some people who will talk about their alternative experiences of reality and sometimes the euphoria that's associated with it. Generally, that's not a problem for the person who's experiencing it. It's a problem for family members and other people in their environment, right? That's not to say that there are extreme experiences of distress that people have where they're seeking support and they actually don't want to be feeling this. But we seem to have got it extremely wrong how to actually support people through these forms of crisis. Linked to MAD studies is this whole idea of spiritual emergence. So there's some groups of folks who are coming from a spiritual perspective who are suggesting that when people have what's usually pathologized as a psychotic break, that this is about spiritual emergence and this is about people coming to know themselves in different ways. If we slap medication into people as soon as that happens, then there's less of an ability to actually try to work through and understand what's happening for the person. But that's just one example. There's several different examples of alternative forms of supporting people within the MAD community. That being just one. Okay, so that being the why, what does actually MAD studies look like in social work? Well, I can say that since the publishing of the text MAD Matters, which is kind of considered the foundational text in MAD studies, that was published in 2013, so 4 years ago now. Several critical schools of social work across the country have actually started teaching their mental health courses from a MAD studies perspective. I can say that 2 years ago, this included 7 schools of social work across the country. I can't say how many are actually doing so now. I'm assuming that number may have risen. I know there are at least 7, but the reason why I can't say is because in the past 4 years, there's been a number of other edited volumes and journal special issues that have come out that people may be adopting instead within these courses. And so I was tracking which schools were teaching MAD studies based on who was adopting, which schools were adopting the textbook. So it's hard to say. Yeah, since its inception in Canada, so MAD studies is really something that is homegrown, that's evolved from Canada, from the MAD community in Canada. But what we've seen is that it's proliferated like wildfire around the world. We see MAD studies courses existing and scholarship existing in places as far away as Japan, in Taiwan, places like Ghana, India, France, the Netherlands, as well as the usual suspects of English-speaking countries like the UK and Australia, New Zealand, South Africa. And also, what I saw today was a new article that came out from someone in Chile writing from a MAD studies perspective about mental health services in Chile. So we also have one edited journal special issue that's dedicated to MAD studies in social work in particular and mental health. So that's something that came out last year. So what we're seeing is that it's been taken up not just in Canada. When we wrote the book MAD Matters, we really thought that this was going to be a very small kind of project that was going to be disseminated within MAD communities, maybe in Vancouver and Toronto and Ottawa. We did not for a second expect that it was going to be read as widely as it has been, and that it would sort of make its way around the world. So it's really a homegrown kind of approach to understanding madness and MAD experience and MAD identity that I think is important for us to consider in social work. So what does it actually look like in social work? Well, I've kind of broken this down into MAD theory, MAD research, MAD practice, MAD methodology. To start off with, I want to say that there's a number of MAD profs in social work across the country. We have Jennifer Poole at Ryerson, we have Adil Abdullahi at Ryerson OC, people like, so these are MAD profs and allies. We have Chris Chapman, we have Gigine Veronka, who's just taken up a place at Windsor, and a number of other people. We also have a number of people who are still in the closet, and they're in the closet about their MAD identity because of the ways in which their particular schools may be less accepting of the politicization of madness and the claiming of MAD identity. Regardless, we've seen some really groundbreaking scholarship coming from social work, particularly in relation to anti-Black scenism, MAD theory, as well as MAD theory as methodology. We've also seen a number of PhD students in social work doing MAD studies-related dissertations. We're seeing this across the country, even within schools of social work where there isn't anybody teaching MAD studies at the BSW or the MSW levels, which is really interesting. And I get emails from those students in particular, because of the ways in which they may feel isolated, but they're nonetheless being allowed to take this into social work at the PhD level, which I think is fabulous. I have a couple of students, PhD students myself, who are doing math studies related dissertations. I have one student in particular that relates a little bit to John's presentation, where she's looking at environmental devastation and the ways in which that provokes distress in people. I have another student who is looking at the experiences of mad social workers in practice and the ways in which hiding mad identity is a survival in order to stay as a social worker. In some provinces, such as Nova Scotia, you have to claim whether you've ever been diagnosed with a mental illness in order to be registered. I know that there's talk of this happening in Ontario as well, and that there's some activism, really good activism taking place to try to stop that from happening. This is going back in time, long time ago, to when social workers said you had to be fit for practice, and that means you couldn't be mentally ill because you might actually be a danger to service users. How can mad social workers be a danger to social workers when we know that violence is enacted upon mad subjects more than what we see in terms of people who have been diagnosed actually engaging in violence towards others? So this is clearly discriminatory and against our human rights legislation, but again, I'm starting to turn away from this notion of we need to take a rights-based approach, civil rights or children's rights in my case, approach to understanding psychiatrization, because I don't actually think this legislation is ever going to see to a more fulsome acceptance of difference within society. But that's another talk for another day. Okay, so how am I doing for time? Okay, I'm doing good. Okay, so what does mad theory look like? Okay, so mad theory, and so now what I'm thinking specifically is what is being incorporated into social work. And so when we talk about mad theory, we talk about centering the analyses of psychiatric survivors, of people who've been deemed mad, understanding them as knowledge holders and learning from them. Okay. Now, the mad theory that has existed within mad studies from its inception has developed with a lot of with kind of a leading role for mad people of color within the Toronto mad studies community. And I think this is really important, and I'm explaining this now because I'm going to explain in the next slide some of the worries about the ways in which mad studies is being whitewashed and being turned into something for white consumption and for the benefit of white mad people. But I'll get there in a minute. What I want to talk about is the contributions of mad people of color. It's been really important from the beginning that mad theory has been intertwined with critical race feminism, transnational feminism, post-colonial theory from its inception. So I'm thinking about people like Rachel Gorman, who is part of that initial small group of mad people in Toronto who was there when Richard Ingram coined the term and was theorizing along with him and others about what mad studies should look like. And this is so important because we have to really understand that racism and psychiatry is not something that we can separate. So if we're going to have a mad studies that is for mad people, we have to have an understanding of anti-racism, and I think critical race theory provides us with that, critical race feminism in particular. It allows us to simultaneously look at sanist violence and racist violence being enacted on mad bodies. Okay. So what am I talking about in this history? When we think about when modern psychiatry developed, it developed at the same time that the colonial project was beginning to develop. Okay, so we see an intertwining of colonialism and psychiatry. We see the development of scientific racism, for example, which was a way of justifying to everyone why it is that the colonizers can come and take the lands of people, exploit them economically. So psychiatry was used as a way to justify colonialism. Psychiatry was evolving, modern psychology was evolving at the exact same time. So I don't know how well I'm explaining this. What we saw over time was that psychiatrists and the colonial scientists were studying colonized people. We're deeming them inferior. We're suggesting that it's through white benevolence we're going to help these people, right? We're not really invading and taking over their lands. We're going there to help them evolve because, of course, they're inferior in some way, right? In many different ways. We saw during the slave trade psychiatrists suggesting that slaves that were running away were actually mentally ill, right? So we're talking about this notion that if you're not serving the purpose of the white Western world, there must be something wrong in your brain. It has nothing to do with the slavery. Something wrong with your brain, right? You're mentally ill. And the treatment, of course, is Samuel Cartwright was the big psychiatrist at the time, and he said the treatment for runaway slaves, of course, is hard labor, preferably outside, and whipping. So we see how this bolstered colonization at the same time as developing psychiatry as a science of the brain and the mind. I can go into that in a little bit more detail, but I don't think I can do so as eloquently as I would like to right now, so perhaps we'll leave it there. What we have seen in Canada is a number of it's just some groundbreaking scholarship. I think I talked to this already, particularly in relation to anti-Black Satanism and how it plays itself out. Now, I want to say that this whole issue of racism and psychiatrization has been intertwined since the beginning of modern psychiatry, since the beginning of colonization. But we also see the ways in which other bodies are targeted current day, right? So we see the ways in which queer bodies, transgender bodies, we see the way that women are targeted, we see the ways that poverty and people in the working classes are overrepresented within the mental health system as well. I think that all of these issues are so incredibly important for us to constantly have an analysis of transphobia, of heterosexism, of classism, of sexism, all of these isms. We need to have an analysis of that integrating into psychiatry, and I think it's really important. But I also think the issue of racism is of central importance because historically it's been there from the beginning of psychiatry. Okay, and we still see that overrepresentation. Okay, so that's a little just kind of touching really fairly lightly on mad theory. There's more that could be said, but I'm going to leave it there because I'm thinking I'm running out of time. What the maddening of research looks like, and I think is important for social work as well to be learning about, is the type of survivor research that's been going on for decades, right? And understanding how the mad theory I just talked about might influence methodology. What do I want to say about that? When we engage in positivistic psychiatric research, we are engaging in a process where a dominant point of view comes to know what it means to be mentally ill. It forms an idea, an understanding, an essentialized, usually, understanding of who we are as people, and that this is very damaging. And I think that what we need to be doing is we need to be turning away from this positivistic form of psychiatric research, which of course looks back to scientific racism again. And we need to be thinking more along the lines of community-based research, about research conducted by Mad people, for people, but also by allies as well, in a way in which the agenda of the researcher is secondary to the agenda of the Mad community. And then maybe we might start getting somewhere in terms of understanding people's experiences and understanding how to help those people who want help. Okay, so social work education. So what we've seen over the past several years is, again, like I said, the teaching of Mad studies as a perspective within mental health courses across the country in social work. This is a very different way of teaching mental health than by teaching the DSM and teaching how to think about people's experiences as pathology, as psychopathology. And instead, it's about learning from the Mad community and learning from people who have those particular experiences. So we're talking about bringing the Mad community into the classroom so that our students can learn from people who are politicized around their experiences of psychiatric oppression. And it's about getting students back into the Mad community and learning about the survivor-led services that are taking place. In the East Coast, there's very little of that happening, but there's quite a lot in other spaces, in bigger cities usually, but also in other countries around the world. And it's about getting students to actually go out and learn about and think about what that might mean for them, and think about what it might mean. One of the assignments that I have in my Mad Studies BSW Level Course is I get students to write a paper where they talk about, where they're meant to imagine that when they graduate, they will actually be working in the area of mental health. And I ask them to design their own framework of practice, right, that is anti-sanist, anti-racist, and that incorporates the ideas of Mad studies. And what I get is just phenomenal, paper after paper, where I'm getting all of these extraordinary ideas of what Mad practice and social workers' roles in it might actually look like. And it's really exciting. So I have some students who talk about being part of that multidisciplinary team and finding loopholes and ways of supporting people that is different than what status quo is. I hear a lot of students instead writing about mental health practices, community development. So what it might mean to actually start up a new service for voice hearers, for example, in ways that are accepting rather than pathologizing. It's extraordinary what is coming from our students, whether they're Mad identified or not. I think the future of Mad studies and social work is coming from our students and their own theorizing and their own ideas about what this might mean in practice. Teaching, of course, also, Mad studies also involves teaching the DSM, teaching about the drugs, but it's also about deconstructing what's problematic about it and what might not be. In terms of social work practice, like I said, this is still yet to be evolved. We've just started teaching students in social work, I would say in the past 4 to 5 years, maybe 6 years for some of us. And I don't think it's actually taking place in practice yet. I see some students graduating and doing some really interesting activism and trying to affect change in different ways, but I don't see practice is actually changing. But it's too early days to know what this might actually mean. I have some ideas of what it might mean. I would suggest that it's understanding the potential role of social workers as Mad allies. It's really what I would say, playing the subordinate attendants to Mad community members. So instead of playing this subordinate role to psychiatric expertise, maybe as social workers we should be out there helping folks in the Mad community who are trying to find alternative ways of supporting each other to think about what they could be doing in an attendant role. Oh, you need a room to meet as a group, maybe I can find a room. Maybe I can be doing some of that administrative secretarial type stuff. Maybe that's the role of social work in Mad studies in practice. I'm not sure. I also think about a little bit about social anarchist practice and what I mean by that. And I'm writing a book on this right now, but it's not going to be out for a while because I'm engaging in slow scholarship yet again. But this is about bringing in principles like voluntary association. So it's not about forced treatment. It's about people coming together because they want to come together as a group. It's about reciprocity, like perhaps similar to what Cindy was talking about today, and it's about mutual aid. What role might social work play as a social anarchist social work in suggesting I am not the expert, but what can I do to help empower those, help work with those people who are trying to find solutions that are nonviolent? I think it's also about decolonizing practice, and Cindy spoke really beautifully about that today, and I wanted to ask a million questions, but it was good that you were allowed to leave before they unleashed me on you. I think it's about deprofessionalizing practice. I think that, you know, it's been so long since I've read arguments coming from social work theorists arguing against deprofessionalization. I mean, there's lots of stuff being written in the 70s in structural social work. We don't see it very much anymore. And I'm thinking, so it's a done deal. We're all professionals. We all have this huge boundary between ourselves and our service users. We're the experts. We're paternalistic. I'm sorry, I think this is still a problem, and I think we need to start thinking about what it might mean to stop being the cheerleaders of professionalism and start thinking, you know what, there might actually be a problem with the fact that we've professionalized. And the whole issue of registration and barring mad social workers from registration speaks to that loudly and clearly, I think. It's about decentering whiteness. Now, said, from its inception, Mad Studies has incorporated a critical race and transnational feminism analysis, also post-colonial theory, into its analysis. But what we're seeing in practice, nonetheless, is that dominant mad subjectivities, i.e. white people who are deemed mad, taking over spaces and pushing out mad people of color. And I think that we need to think about what it might mean to work with mad communities to stop that from happening. Adil Abdullahi writes about how the ways in which mad people of color are silenced within community meetings with mad people because they might actually be pushing the dissent a little bit too far, making it a little bit more uncomfortable for white mad people. We need to think about how racism is reproduced in these spaces and stop that from happening. Also seeing that the ways that Mad Studies is being taken up in different countries around the world in the way that it is being whitewashed, and how this analysis of racism seems to be disappearing. Right? I think this is a big worry. It's just as much of a worry from the perspective of the critiques we have of anti-oppressive practice. So important for us to think about all of these isms, but the ways in which racism just kind of disappears or so easily dissolved within our anti-oppressive analysis. Which is, again, whenever I talk about anti-oppression, I talk about anti-racism and anti-oppression, as well as anti-Satanism, in order to try to force this notion that we cannot allow ourselves to not center these major issues. Okay. I'm almost done, I promise. So I think mad practice is something that shows social workers can bolster, that they can validate, that they can take not a leadership role in, but can be really supportive towards. I don't know what that's going to look like in practice, but I still think it's yet to happen, and it is happening. It's not something that we can ignore as, okay, so Brenda's up there talking about all this idealistic mad pride stuff. Actually, it's happening. And we don't know what it's going to look like, but we're going to start seeing what it looks like very, very shortly. There have been worries that have been expressed in the MAD community around the appropriation and the co-opting of MAD studies within social work. This is so incredibly important because we have seen how social work has done this and mental health practice has done this with other grassroots approaches. So I think of the recovery approach, the recovery model. This is something that actually sprang from the psychiatric survivor community. And what has it done now that it's pretty much policy in the white Western world, English-speaking world? Now that it's policy, what does it look like? It looks like the psychiatric agenda. If you want to recover, take your pills, have your ECT. So it's really just an appropriation and a changing of the intention of what the model was supposed to be about in the first place. We also saw this with peer support. I don't talk about peer support anymore, I talk about mutual aid, because what we see is services hiring a bunch of peers, people with lived experience of mental illness, so that you could come in and we will give you a wage to help you coerce your peers into taking their drugs, into having that ECT, etc. Okay? We also see this now in trauma-informed care. Very, very disturbing. This again comes from the psychiatric survivor community, this notion that we need to be focusing not on what's going on in our brains, but the trauma that we've experienced in the real world. And so what's happened? After 20 years of shouting this off the rooftops, mental health services is starting to incorporate trauma-informed care that conveniently lets us avoid what's happening in the real world. So again, we're reproducing the experiences inside your body as a result of the trauma. We can completely forget about violence in society. Why aren't we putting the money towards ending violence in society? We're not. We're still looking at what's going on inside our bodies. Okay? And I was thinking about this as well when Cindy was talking, because not long ago I reviewed an article as a masked peer reviewer for a journal, and it was a white social work practitioner who was talking about children's rights of all things and intergenerational trauma. And line after line after line of this paper was, we need within child protection systems to understand that Indigenous people have been traumatized by colonization, and this is impacting their children and making them mentally ill. Right? So we need to, and again, the blaming, it wasn't even masked. And so I think, anyway, there's all sorts of fears around the ways in which MAD studies can be taken up in the same ways in which these other approaches have been taken up in ways that, again, it's almost like the neoliberal machine takes over and turns it into something that is violent and harmful all over again, instead of coming from the understanding of people's actual lived experiences. The MAD community has also expressed concerns about MAD studies finding a strong place so quickly within academia, and the ways in which it may become detached from grassroots MAD activism, research, theorizing, and MAD practices. So again, MAD studies is something that happens, and we talked about it earlier when I talked about it being in discipline. We're talking about it's something that takes place in the academy, but also in the community, right? The boundary between the ivory tower is blurred. But once the academic industrial complex takes over, it's likely to turn into something that the universities can make money about and becomes detached from the MAD community itself. These are worries. I hope I didn't go over too much. Thanks.